There is a story everyone tells about how he got dogs. A soft-hearted hunter finds a wolf pup alone and carries it home. Feeds it, raises it, teaches it to sit at the fire. And after enough patience and enough kindness, the wolf becomes a dog. It is a lovely story. It is also wrong. Not wrong in the details. Wrong in the one part that actually matters. Every version of that story has a human doing the choosing. And that is almost certainly backwards. Because the animals did the choosing, and they chose our rubbish. Start with what a human camp actually was 15,000 years ago. Not a village, not a farm, a handful of shelters and a fire. But it had something no other place in the landscape had. It had leftovers. Humans are wasteful. We always have been. We take the good parts of a carcass and leave the rest behind. Scraps, bones, fat, skin, anything too much trouble to carry. To us, that was a waste heap. To a hungry animal, it was a miracle. Because food in the wild is not reliable. It moves. It fights back. It runs. A hunt can fail for a week. A camp does not move for a month. For the first time in the history of the planet, food had an address. And that changed everything for one particular animal. Wolves were already living alongside us, following the same herds, hunting the same animals, walking the same valleys, watching. We were not strangers. We were competitors who kept bumping into each other. So when the waste heaps appeared, wolves noticed immediately. But noticing it and eating from it are two completely different problems. Because to reach that food, an animal has to do something almost impossible. It has to walk toward the most dangerous predator on Earth. And here's the thing about that. Not every animal can. Every wild animal carries a number it cannot argue with. Biologists call it flight distance. It is simply how close a threat can get before the animal turns and runs. And it is not a mood. It is not a choice. It is wiring. Every animal in a population has a slightly different setting. Most wolves had a large one, 200 paces, and they were gone. A few, by pure accident of birth, had a smaller one. They were not braver. Bravery is the wrong word entirely. Bold animals approach and get driven off. Bold is not what wins here. These were animals that simply felt less alarmed at the same distance. Calm, not courageous. And the difference decided everything that followed. Because the calmer animals could eat, and the others could not. Not once. Every single night, for thousands of years. And an advantage that repeats every night stops being luck. It becomes a filter. The calmer animals ate better. Better-fed animals raise more young. And calm parents tend to have calm offspring, because the setting is inherited. Nobody selected for it. Nobody intended it. The rubbish heap did the work. Which is the part that makes this story so strange. There was no plan. There was no first dog. There was no moment. Just a fear response getting quietly smaller, generation after generation. That is a nice theory, but a theory is not proof. You cannot rerun 15,000 years to check. Except that, more or less, somebody did. In 1959, a Soviet scientist began an experiment in Siberia. His name was Dmitry Belyaev, and his subject was silver foxes. He was working in a country where his field was politically dangerous. Genetics had been branded a false science, and researchers had lost careers over it. So the fox farm was, officially, about fur quality. Unofficially, Belyaev was testing the question at the heart of this video. What happens if you select an animal for calmness, and nothing else? The rule was strict, and it was the whole point of the design. A researcher approaches an enclosure and offers a hand. Any animal that stays calm goes on to be a parent. That is the only test. Not size, not coat, not cleverness, not anything you can see. One behavior, one measurement, repeated across generations. and the foxes started changing almost immediately. Within a handful of generations, they were seeking people out, approaching, following, behaving, in short, like an animal that trusts you. Which is remarkable on its own, but it is not the famous part. The famous part is everything else that changed, uninvited. Their ears went floppy. Their tails began to curl upward instead of hanging straight. Their coats broke into patches and white markings. Their snouts shortened. Their skulls became rounder and more juvenile. Their breeding seasons shifted. Even their hormone levels moved. Not one of those traits was selected for. Not one. Belayev only ever chose the calm ones. Everything else came along for free. That package has a name now. Domestication syndrome. And it shows up in animal after animal, in almost the same order. The likely reason is a group of cells in the early embryo. Those cells travel through the body as it forms. And on the way, they help build several very different things. Ear cartilage, coat pigment, jaw shape, and the glands behind the fear response. So turning the fear response down slightly nudges all of them at once. Which means floppy ears are not a design choice. They are a side effect. And it means the calm wolves at our rubbish heaps were changing shape too. Slowly, without anybody breeding them, without anybody noticing. But shape is the shallow part of this. Something deeper changed. Take the simplest test in animal cognition. Pointing. Hide food under one of two cups, then point at the correct one. A dog follows your finger and gets it right, almost every time. Human toddlers pass this test. Most animals do not. And here is the detail that matters. Wolves fail it. Wolves raised by people from birth still fail it. Puppies pass it before their eyes have properly finished developing, which tells you it is not learning. It is equipment they are born with. Somewhere in all that scavenging, dogs evolved to read us. And then they went further and evolved a face aimed at us. There is a small muscle above a dog's eye that lifts the inner eyebrow. It makes the eyes look bigger, softer, and slightly sad. You know the expression. Every dog owner on earth knows it. Wolves do not have that muscle, not in any usable form. Dogs grew it, on our time scale, for no reason except that we responded. When a dog makes that face, people reach for it. People feed it. So the dogs that could make it were the dogs that did better. That is an animal evolving a signal for a completely different species. There is almost nothing else like it in the natural world. Which brings us to the question underneath all of this. When did it stop being useful and start being something else? Usefulness leaves obvious traces. Affection is much harder to prove. Unless somebody buried the evidence, and somebody did. In 1914, workers in a German quarry uncovered something. Two people, laid to rest together, roughly 14,000 years ago. And beside them, a young dog. For a long time, nobody looked closely at the animal. When researchers finally did, the teeth told an uncomfortable story. That dog had been seriously ill as a puppy. Badly ill. Illness that severe leaves marks on the teeth as they grow. An animal that's sick could not hunt, could not guard, could not work. It could not do a single useful thing for the people around it. And it survived for weeks anyway. Which is only possible if somebody kept it warm and gave it water. Somebody sat with a useless, dying animal and looked after it. 14,000 years ago, before farming, before writing, before villages. People who had almost nothing spent what they had on a dog. And when it died, they did not discard it. They laid it with their own. That is not livestock. That is not a tool. That is not a resource. Compare it with every other animal we brought in afterwards. Those we penned. We bred them for meat, milk, hide, and labor. We kept them at arm's length, and we still do. The dog is the only one that came inside. Inside the shelter, beside the fire, onto the bed, into the will. So did ancient humans create dogs? Not the way the campfire story says. Nobody tamed a wolf. Nobody sat down and trained the wildness out of anything. We left our rubbish outside, night after night, for thousands of years. And a few animals, born slightly calmer than the rest, came close enough to eat. Everything else followed from that. The ears, the face, the bond. We did not build the dog. We just left the door open. And something walked through it and never left. That partnership is older than farming, older than writing, older than every empire. If your dog is nearby, that is 15,000 years old.